Psalm 44 tonight, Psalm 44, a prayer of the distressed is what I've titled the message. It again has the superscription to the chief musician, a contemplation of the sons of Korah. Just to remind you, those sons of Korah trace their heritage back to a man in the Old Testament named Korah who led a rebellion. He was a Levite, really had a privileged position of service, but he wasn't happy with that. Korah and his rebellious friends, they said to Moses and Aaron, "What makes you think you're special? We're all holy. We're all the Lord's people. We should be able to do the same thing you're doing." Well, challenging Moses and Aaron's leadership was not a good move. The earth opened up, swallowed them alive in their rebellion. Obviously, his children were not involved because they survived. And they came to have a prominent place, it would seem to be, in leading worship as Levites in Israel. Also, they are called the gatekeepers. So it seems there's evidently some combination of singers and gatekeepers, a lot of Levites. So they probably had a number of different assisting roles as they helped in the worship in Israel. When it says contemplation of the sons of Korah, it may mean that this was given to them to perform since they were singers and worship leaders. It doesn't necessarily mean that they wrote it. This phrase, sons of Korah, appears in a total of 11 psalms, so it's somewhat prominent in the songbook, in the Psalms. The occasion of this particular psalm was a time of miserable defeat in Israel, although we don't know when, we don't know the exact occasion, but it was a time of national distress where the enemy was having their way with Israel. Often in the Psalms, the cause of the distress is shown to be sin, but in this case, in Psalm 44, it's not a matter of sin. And here is why the writer is perplexed. Why is this happening to us since we have been faithful? And he argues that point very strongly. So here's the outline I put together as far as this. Let's back up. There we go. Outline for Psalm 44, a prayer of the distressed. Verses 1 through 3, God's past victories for Israel. He remembers how God has worked in the past. Why isn't he doing it now? He's done this in the past. Why isn't he doing it now? 4 through 8, confident God will bring future victory. So really strong. Yes, God is our strength. He brings victory. But then 9 through 16, God's allowing of defeat and crisis. He rehearses. Here's where we are. We're in defeat right now. And then 17 through 19, a protest of faithfulness. We're in defeat, and why? We've been faithful. 20 through 22, obedience and yet defeat. Kind of continues that theme. And then a plea and hopeful prayer at the end of the psalm. Well, let's get into it. Verse 1. "We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us the deeds you did in their days, in days of old." So they have, as a people, they have had the history passed down as far as how God has worked in the past in Israel's history. And they were told to pass along their rich history, going back to Abraham, the patriarchs, then the Exodus, and the birth of the nation, then entry into the promised land under Joshua. God worked mightily and miraculously to make them a people, to give them the land. And in this process showed over and over that he is the one true God, the God of Israel. They handed this down, the history of this, down to generation after generation. "We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us." They told us, they passed it along, the deeds you did, God, in their days, in days of old. So they knew about how God had worked. Verse 2, he recounts some of it. "You drove out the nations with your hand, but them you planted. You afflicted the peoples and cast them out. For they did not gain possession of the land by their own sword, nor did their own arm save them, but it was your right hand, your arm, in the light of your countenance, because you favored them." Note the strong dual emphasis here. God did it. They didn't do it. Strong emphasis. They are not a self-made people. It was God alone who drove out the nations. You drove out the nations, he says, with your hand. He planted them. as a people. They didn't put themselves in that position. God planted them. He afflicted the Canaanites. He cast them out. God's doing all this. On the other side of the coin, they didn't do this by their own sword, he says, nor by their own arm, their own strength. Again, it was God's right hand of might, his arm in the light of his countenance, meaning the presence of his favor. God in grace brought them to where they were. And so he says, verse 4, you are my king, O God. Command victories for Jacob. The writer, in a sense, personalizes it, brings it right up to date, saying, you are my king, O God. And then with the petition, command victories for Jacob. Verse 5, through you we will push down our enemies. He's confident. We're still going to have victory here. Through you we will push down our enemies. Through your name we will trample those who rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, nor shall my sword save me. Still not confident in himself, his own resources, his own strength. But you have saved us from our enemies and have put to shame those who hated us. So there's a confident faith here that God is still going to work. He's worked in the past. He's confident he's going to work now. He has learned the lesson of history. It is through God that God's people have victory over their enemies. He recognizes their dependence upon God, and he affirms that his trust really is not in himself or human resources, but rather that God is the Savior, and that it is he who gives victory over the enemy. And so he says, verse 8, in God we boast all day long and praise your name forever. Selah. It's a great memory verse. If you haven't memorized it, I suggest that you do. In God we boast all the day long and praise your name forever. Tremendous truth there. In God, he says, we're boasting. Every day we're boasting. Continually. We're giving him praise. And we're going to do this forever. Since God has done it, since he gives the victory, God's people should exalt him. Give him the glory. Boast in him all the day long. The praise and the thanks belong to him forever. How true that is. This is giving credit where credit belongs, and it belongs to God alone. Selah is thought by most to be a reflective pause, kind of like stop and think about this or stop and soak this in. The first 8 verses reflect on the greatness of God and the victory that he gives to his people. It properly champions the position of faith and reliance upon God, not self, but reliance upon God. And so the theology of the writer is very good and strong. We say amen to each one of the points that he's making all the way through here. But guess what? Guess what? People are complicated and complex. It's amazing how the same person can know right theology and hold to it with conviction, and yet at the same time struggle. At the same time have mixed emotions and spiritual struggles as they grapple with the whys of life. We see that here. Verse 9 denotes a complete change of tone. The confidence and the faith and, that he has asserted here in the first 8 verses. Now we see a different tone. Charles Spurgeon said at this point about this psalm, a pause comes in fitly here when we are about to descend from the highest to the lowest key. Yeah, he's been up on this high mountain of faith and what God has done and what God will do. And now it goes pretty low. Verse 9. But you have cast us off and put us to shame, and you do not go out with our armies. It's like, we're going out here, we're all alone. Now, if you give God all the credit for your victories, then what do you do when you experience defeat? Huh? Good question, huh? Well, since God is sovereign, he must either be causing it all or allowing it. And the sense seems to be that they've been boasting in God. All the day, every day, they're boasting in God. But when they went out to fight, it's like God wasn't with them. They suffered defeat, which would seem to indicate that God was not with them on this occasion. He did not come through as he so notably has done in the past. This left them ashamed of their testimony. It's like the football team that brags mightily before the game, only to suffer a huge defeat. You know what that is? Deflating. That brings shame. That's how the psalmist felt. We've been bragging on our God. He's with us, and he gives us a victory, and we are what we are because of our God. And all of a sudden, what a setback. Where's God? Matthew Poole wrote, "Put to shame, made us ashamed of our boasting and trust in you, which we often profess to the face of our enemies." This makes us ashamed. Where is our God? And the enemy said, "Yeah, where is your God? We got you." Ooh, that's brutal. So the writer is now very honest to God about his feelings. In verses 10 through 16, notice he just kind of unloads on God, if you will. Now, I think we want to do that very reverently, but there's a place to just be transparent. God knows what you're thinking anyway. Verse 10, "You make us turn back from the enemy." Notice what he says, you, God, are responsible for this. "You make us turn back from the enemy, and those who hate us have taken spoil for themselves. You have given us up like sheep intended for food, and have scattered us among the nations. You sell your people for next to nothing." It's not like we're valuable. It's like we don't matter. "And are not enriched by selling them. You make us a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn and a derision to those all around us." Everyone's mocking us. "You make us a byword, an example of scorn among the nations, a shaking of the head among the peoples. My dishonor is continually before me, and the shame of my face has covered me, because of the voice of him who reproaches and reviles, because of the enemy and the avenger." In view is apparently a national defeat that was painfully embarrassing. Not only were they defeated, but they were also robbed of goods and their dignity. They became an object of mocking and scorn. No one had any regard for them or their God at this point. They hung their head in shame. For 7 verses, he carries on describing how horribly demoralizing the situation was for them as a people who boasted in God all the day long. Where are you? This defeat was truly disastrous and painful. And why did it happen? That's the great question on the table. Why? Why? Verse 17, "All this has come upon us, but we have not forgotten you, nor have we dealt falsely with your covenant." Now, it's common in the Psalms for calamity to come upon someone because of their sin. We would expect that. In fact, that would be consistent with the conditional Old Covenant, which promised blessing on obedience and curses on disobedience. So if you're walking in obedience, you're expecting blessing. What's this? I mean, all over the Old Testament, you have verses like this. Deuteronomy chapter 11, 26 through 28. "Behold, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. With blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I command you today to go after other gods which you have not known." This is his point. We've been walking in the way of blessing. What's this? This is the thing that is so hard for the writer to get his head around. All this calamity has come upon them in spite of the fact that they have not forgotten God. They have not dealt unfaithfully with the covenant relationship they had with God. They've been living faithfully according to covenant regulations. It's because of this horrendous defeat doesn't make spiritual sense to the writer. William MacDonald says, "The puzzling thing about all this defeat and shame was that it was not brought on by any conscious backsliding on Israel's part. At other times in history, there was a definite connection between suffering and sin." Well, that makes sense. But in this particular case, it was not so. Verse 18, "Our heart has not turned back. No. Nor have our steps departed from your way." The psalmist insists they've been faithful. And therefore, this doesn't make sense to him. He pleads their case of faithfulness and complains that in spite of their faithfulness, God has dealt very severely with them. Verse 19, but you have severely broken us in the place of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death. Now, jackals were part of the wolf family. They feed largely on carrion, that is decaying flesh of dead animals. And they are noted for their piercing, dismal howling. You ever seen a jackal? We don't have many jackals around here. But the place of jackals symbolically speaks of ruin and desolation. Even their howling speaks of this. The shadow of death is the very dark place where the threat of death is lurking. That's where we are, he says. Note the writer again applies what is happening to them as if God is responsible. God is behind it. He specifically says, you have severely broken us. David Gazik says, in Psalm 44, we sense the psalmist honestly, not self-righteously, makes the case that their present distress was not due to unaddressed sin or rebellion. In firm but polite protest, the psalmist insisted that Israel's faithfulness to God had been answered by disaster sent by God. Wow, how's that? We have been faithfully following you, and this is what we get. Verse 20, if we had forgotten the name of our God or stretched out our hands to a foreign God, if we'd fallen into idolatry, I'd get it. That's not what we've done. Verse 21, would not God search this out? For he knows the secrets of the heart. He reasons that if indeed they had forgotten God, been involved in idol worship, then God would certainly know it, because indeed he knows the secrets of the heart. Nothing is hidden from him. There are no secrets with God. He knows all, including the inner recesses of the heart. All the thoughts, all the motives of the heart. I like this meme. When we sin in secret, God is our only audience. Yeah, how true that is. Sometimes people think, well, I get away with it. It's in secret. You don't get away with it. God knows everything. He strongly here appeals to their innocence, even to the point of appealing to God's omniscience, saying, in effect, God, you know. He is very sure that what has come upon them is not because of sin, certainly not because of any known sin. And so he says, verse 22, yet for your sake we are killed all day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Notice this happens to God's people sometimes. Not because of anything they've done wrong, which is the context here, but simply because they're standing for God. For your sake. That's why he says this is happening, because of their stand for God. Notice again his appeal to their innocence. Verse 17, we have not forgotten you, nor have we dealt falsely with your covenant. Verse 18, our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. Note again the language of verse 22 where he says, yet for your sake. Again, David Gazik says, for your sake are important words. It means that they had suffered in faithfulness to God. And because of their faithfulness to God. Without developing the thought, this psalm suggests a revolutionary concept to the Old Testament man or woman of God. Suffering may not be a punishment, but a battle scar. The price of loyalty in a world which is at war with God. That was kind of a new concept. But it's an important concept in the Bible. There is such a thing as suffering simply for being in the will of God. And not because of anything you have done wrong. There's mystery here. But we must always remember that God's ways are not our ways. They're ever as far above us as the heavens are above the earth. Peter writes to the suffering saints, and he addresses this on a number of levels. But in chapter 3, he says, it is better, if it is the will of God, and sometimes it is, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Sometimes you suffer for doing good. just because you're doing good. 1 Peter 4:19, therefore let those who suffer according to the will of God, sometimes it is the will of God, commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful Creator. Sometimes it is the will of God for the righteous to suffer for reasons they know nothing about or can't comprehend. It is for God's sake. If it is for God's sake, then we can rest assured that God will use it. He is a faithful Creator. Notice again, it's not because of sin. It's not because of stupidity. He says, it's for your sake. We are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. God's people are not exempt from terrible things happening to them. You say, well, if I just walk with God, you know this prosperity gospel is the most false gospel in the world. Just if I just walk with God, if I just have faith, I'll have everything. Health, wealth, prosperity, it'll all be mine. What Bible are we reading? That is so ridiculous. Sometimes it is the will of God for us to suffer. And sometimes it's for reasons we don't understand or can't make sense of. We're constantly trying to find a good reason. But sometimes it's ordained of God, and it's of such a nature, it doesn't make any sense to us. And yet we have to come back to faith and realize God has a purpose in everything. This has been the experience of God's people down through the ages. It's been well stated. Believers who suffer are the rule, not the exception. William Newell says, the saints are sheep for the slaughter. Name yourself among them and cease contending for your rights in a world that has cast out Christ. Put up over your mirror the motto, I am Christ, a sheep for the slaughter. There is a reason Christ said, take up your cross and follow me. You know what the cross represented, right? Death. Death. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. The psalmist knew the truth of God's power and victory, as stated in the first 8 verses of the psalm. But in his experience, it seems God is allowing them to be killed constantly in spite of their commitment to him. And the most natural thing in the world is to ask, why? Verse 23, awake! Wake up, God! Awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? Arise, do not cast us off forever. Why? Why do you hide your face? Twice, why? Why? Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our body clings to the ground. Note, again, the repeated why question. He asked, why do you sleep? Now, God does not really sleep, and I believe the psalmist knew this very well. But in this situation, his lack of intervening activity is portrayed in this way. It's like God is just asleep, not doing anything. And so he figuratively pleads with God to awake and do something, intervene, do something to help us in this situation. And again he asks, saying, why do you hide your face? Where are you, God? You haven't shown up here. Where are you? You're hiding from us. Now, sometimes it is the will of God for his faithful children to suffer, and sometimes we have no idea why. We cry out for an explanation, and there is silence. This is a major test of faith. It is like the psalmist's faith in verses 1 through 8 is here being tested. It's like a Job-like experience. Job went through all the horrendous things he experienced as the most blameless and upright man on the earth, according to God's own testimony, Job 1. And yet he had no idea why this was happening to him. It was a test. God and Satan were having a contest over Job. Have you considered my servant Job? Satan says, you just remove this hedge and he'll curse you. So we went round after round. But Job had no idea what's going on in the background between God and Satan. He had no idea the role he played in this. He didn't know why, and yet he did know he was being tested Job said in Job 23:10, he knows the way that I take, and when he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. The point, however, is Job didn't know the why. He never did find out the why as far as we know in the book. When we go through a shadow of death experience, it's good to realize others have been here before. We're not the first one to experience something like this. For whatever reasons, God allows us to go through it for his sovereign purposes. Sometimes all we can do is bow and worship as Job did. All we know is God and he is sovereign and he is good. As Peter says, he is a faithful creator. Now I'm thankful the New Testament adds to this verse. Paul, you see, quotes from Psalm 44:22 in Romans 8:36. And immediately he follows up with this verse. I'm thankful for further New Testament revelation. Here's what we have. Paul quoting, he's quoting from Psalm 44:22. And he says, as it is written, he's quoting here, for your sake we are killed all day long, we are counted as sheep for the slaughter. And then he says, yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. So this quote from Psalm 44:22 comes in the same chapter, the very same chapter of Romans 8, where just a few verses earlier we have the promise that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Warren Wiersbe says this, those who give their lives in his cause are conquerors, not victims. And God can be glorified even in what seems like defeat. We can't always explain the so-called tragedies of life, especially those that happen to God's people. But Romans 8:28 is still in the Bible. It is. And that's where our faith comes in. We can't make sense of many things. We often don't see the final chapter on how God is working and his sovereign purposes on this side of glory. But I think we're going to applaud God. We're going to really say, wow, the riches of your wisdom. We didn't begin to comprehend in this life what you were doing, but it is for your ultimate glory and our ultimate good. He closes out the psalm, verse 26. Arise for our help and redeem us for your mercy's sake. The psalm ends where we should go when we have a tremendous experience of defeat, in spite of the fact that we've been serving God faithfully. We pour out our heart to God, admitting we can't understand it. And yet we continue to wait on him to act according to his sovereign will. The psalm ends with a plea for God's help, that he would yet bring about deliverance. And he asks that God answer for the sake of his mercies. The word mercies is that Hebrew word, again, hesed, which is often translated as loving kindness, steadfast love, faithful love. It's really linked with God's covenant faithfulness. He asked God to respond in keeping with his faithful covenant love. And again, this is where faith comes in. We need to know God will always respond in keeping, ultimately, with his covenant faithfulness. He will not break covenant with us. Even if that involves him working in ways that we can't understand, still we know he is faithful. It's like Spurgeon said, when we can't trace his hand, we must trust his heart. Johann Sebastian Bach, what a life he lived. He lost his little daughter, and then 3 sons, and then his wife. Things are really going south. Then he remarried, had a second wife, lost 4 more daughters, 3 sons, 11 beloved children. Wow. Lost 11 children. Many researchers have wondered how Bach managed to handle those losses. How did he not stop breathing? How did his heart not stop? And most importantly, how could he continue to write music? The most beautiful music the world has ever heard. Do you know how he did it? Bach would often sign his compositions with the Latin initials SDG, which stands for Soli Deo Gloria, meaning glory to God alone. And he would often begin his pieces with the Latin initials JJ, which stands for Jesu Juva, meaning Jesus help me. That's how he coped. I don't know you're going to improve much on that. All the way we need to look to Jesus for his help. Ending everything we do. To God be the glory. We should start and end every day that way. May this be the expression of our lifelong song. Even if we can't understand the why of what is happening, even if it makes no sense to us, may we continue to seek God every step of the way. And may we continue to say, in God we boast all the day long and praise your name forever. Selah. When it's all said and done, if it is for God's sake that we are killed all day long and are accounted as sheep for the slaughter, even in this faith says, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. The final word for the believer on all the hard, impossible things to comprehend in this life, the final word is conquer. Yea, more than conquer. As Paul says, thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And that comes at the end of the resurrection chapter of 1 Corinthians 15. We won't realize the final victory, the final what it means to be more than a conqueror. We won't realize that until ultimately Resurrection Day. But Resurrection Day is coming, the best is yet to be, and in the end, it will be true that we are victors, more than conquerors, through our Lord Jesus Christ. Let's stand and have our concluding song here.